Cigarette smoke, stale peppermint, and damp wool. That was the smell of Chanel's childhood home when she returned after 7 years. She expected her mother's suffocating hugs and her father's quiet disappointment. She didn't expect the man who broke her heart sitting at the kitchen table, casually holding their mortgage. Gravel crunched beneath the balding tires of Chanel's sedan as she pulled into the driveway. She killed the engine, letting the heavy silence of the neighborhood wash over her. It was late October, and the air held a damp, biting chill that seeped straight through her thin Chicago trench coat. She stared through the windshield at the house. The yellow paint, once cheerful, was peeling in long, ugly strips, exposing the gray, rotting wood beneath. The front porch sagged on the left side, groaning under the weight of overgrown ivy. It looked like a dying thing. Chanel gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She hadn't wanted to come back to this town. She had spent the last 7 years clawing her way out of its suffocating gravity, building a sterile, predictable life in the city. But the phone call from her mother had been different this time, less nagging, more of a fragile, trembling plea. "Your father isn't well, Chanel. Please." She grabbed her duffel bag from the passenger seat, the heavy canvas rough against her palms. The walk to the front door felt like a march to an execution. The second her foot hit the first wooden step, it shrieked a high, grating sound she remembered from her teenage years, back when she used to sneak out at 2 a.m. Before she could even turn the brass knob, the door pulled open. Martha Perez stood in the entryway. She looked smaller. That was Chanel's first jarring thought. Her mother had shrunk. The floral blouse hung off her shoulders, and her collarbones protruded like delicate bird wings. "Chanel," Martha breathed, her voice a papery whisper. Chanel dropped her bag and stepped into the embrace. Her mother felt brittle, smelling faintly of medicinal rub and old lavender. Chanel closed her eyes, swallowing the sudden, sharp lump in her throat. "Hi, Mom. Look at you. You look so thin," Martha murmured, pulling back to inspect her, her hands trembling slightly against Chanel's arms. "Are you eating?" "I'm fine, Mom. Where's Dad?" Martha's smile faltered, her gaze dropping to the scuffed hardwood floor. "Living room. He's resting. The doctor gave him a new medication. It knocks the wind right out of him." Chanel walked past her mother, her boots thudding softly against the faded Persian runner. The house felt like a museum of a life she used to live. The floral wallpaper was yellowing at the seams. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with a heavy, rhythmic dread. In the living room, the television was muttering a low-volume infomercial. Arthur Perez was asleep in his worn leather recliner. His skin was gray, his breathing labored and wet. Chanel stopped at the edge of the carpet, sea-browing her arms over her chest defensively. She hated seeing him like this. Her father had always been a towering figure of rigid authority, a man who spoke in absolutes and demanded perfection. Seeing him reduced to this fragile, wheezing shell felt entirely wrong. "He wouldn't go to the hospital," Martha whispered, coming up behind her. "Said it costs too much." Chanel frowned, her cynical edge immediately sharpening. "He has insurance. The union negotiated that before he retired." Martha looked away, wiping a speck of invisible dust from the mantelpiece. "The premiums went up, Chanel. Things got tight. We had to make choices." Chanel's stomach gave a familiar, uncomfortable twinge, the exact twinge that had driven her away. The unspoken secrets, the quiet, desperate martyrdom of her parents. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, needing a glass of water. The kitchen linoleum was sticky beneath her soles. As she reached into the cabinet for a glass, her eyes fell on the small ceramic rooster her mother used to hold recipes. A stack of envelopes was wedged beneath it. Most of them were stamped with aggressive, red lettering. "Final notice. Past due." Chanel yanked the stack out. Electric, gas, property tax, and a thick envelope from a collection agency she didn't recognize. "Mom," Chanel called out, her voice hard. She walked back into the hallway, waving the envelopes. "What is this? Why didn't you tell me you were drowning?" Martha wrung her hands. "Your father didn't want you to know. You have your own life. He has his pride." "Pride doesn't keep the lights on," Chanel snapped. immediately regretting the harshness in her tone when she saw her mother flinch. She let out a long, ragged breath, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "How bad is it? Exactly how much do you owe?" "It's not just the bills," Martha said, her voice barely audible over the ticking clock. "Your father, he took a loan to fix the roof last winter. He didn't go to a bank, Chanel. The banks wouldn't look at us." Cold dread poured down Chanel's spine. Growing up in this town, you knew what it meant when someone couldn't go to a bank. You went to the underbelly. You went to the people who operated out of back rooms in strip clubs and auto body shops. "Who did he go to?" Chanel asked, her voice dropping to a deadened whisper. Martha shook her head, tears finally spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. "I don't know the man's name, but they started calling last week. They said if we don't have the money by the 1st of the month, they're taking the house." Chanel looked back at her father, still sleeping, completely oblivious to the crumbling world around him. She felt a sudden, suffocating wave of anger at him, at the town, at herself, for staying away so long. She had run from this place to escape being dragged down with it. Yet here she was, the anchor wrapped tightly around her ankle, once again. "I'll fix it," Chanel lied. The words tasted like ash. Sleep was a joke. Chanel lay in her childhood bed, staring up at the glow in the dark stars she had stuck to the ceiling when she was 12. They were faded now, emitting only a sickly, pale green luminescence. The mattress was lumpy, and the radiator hissed and clanked in the corner, a metallic rhythm that grated against her frayed nerves. It was 2:14 a.m. She kicked off the heavy quilt, her t-shirt clinging to her back. The air in the room was stifling, thick with the smell of old dust and closed windows. She needed air. She needed a drink. Anything to stop the frantic calculus happening in her brain. $80,000. That's what her mother had finally confessed. $80,000 her father owed to a ghost who was threatening to take the only thing they owned. Chanel padded out into the hallway, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She knew exactly which spots on the stairs to avoid to prevent them from creaking. Muscle memory. You never really forget the geography of your own escape routes. She reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the kitchen. The house was dark, save for the amber glow of the street lamp bleeding through the kitchen blinds. Chanel stepped onto the cold linoleum, heading for the refrigerator. Then she smelled it. It wasn't a smell that belonged in this house. It was the sharp, metallic tang of an extinguished match, layered over expensive, dark roast coffee and wintergreen. Chanel froze. Her heart slammed into her ribs, a violent physical reaction that made her vision swim. "You always walked on the sides of your feet when you were trying to be quiet," a voice said from the shadows. Low, raspy. A voice that felt like heavy grit and velvet. Chanel couldn't breathe. Her lungs locked up. She turned her head slowly toward the small, round dining table tucked into the corner of the kitchen. A figure was sitting in her father's chair. The amber light from the window caught the sharp angle of a jaw, the heavy wool of a dark overcoat, and the glint of a silver lighter flipping open and closed. Snick, click, snick, click. She didn't scream. Her cynicism kicked in, replacing the sheer terror with a bizarre, adrenaline-fueled numbness. She took a slow step backward, her hand blindly reaching behind her until her fingers brushed the cold metal handle of a butter knife resting on the dish rack. It was pathetic, but it grounded her. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking only slightly. "Get out of my house before I call the police." The man leaned forward into the stripes of the street lamp's light. Chanel dropped the knife. It clattered loudly against the floor, a deafening sound in the quiet house. He didn't look like a boy anymore. The last time she had seen him, he was 21, standing in the rain outside a bus station, begging her not to get on. Now, he was a man carved from stone and exhaustion. His dark hair was shorter, styled impeccably, but his eyes were the same, dark, bottomless, and utterly weary. He had a faint, jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, breaking the perfect symmetry of his face. "Hello, Chanel," Lincoln Brown said. Her stomach violently bottomed out. Nausea, hot and fast, washed over her. "Lincoln." He didn't smile. He just watched her, his gaze sweeping over her oversized sleep shirt, her tangled hair, and the trembling of her hands. It was an invasive look, one that stripped away the years and the distance and left her completely exposed. "You look exactly the same," he murmured, sliding the silver lighter into the pocket of his coat. "What are you doing here?" Chanel choked out, taking another step back. The air felt too thin. The kitchen was suddenly too small. "How did you get in?" "Back door. Lock still broken. You used to use it to sneak out to see me." His tone was casual, but the words held a heavy, deliberate weight. Chanel's hands balled into fists. She hated him. She hated the way her body betrayed her, the way her pulse hammered against her throat, the way the smell of him still triggered a primal, instinctual comfort, buried deep beneath years of resentment. He was the reason she left. He was the heir to a bloodline she refused to be a part of. When his older brother was killed, Lincoln had dropped out of college, put on a suit, and walked into a life of organized violence. Chanel had given him an ultimatum. He chose the family. She chose the bus. "Get out," Chanel said, her voice finding its edge. "I don't know what kind of nostalgic power trip you're on, but I'm not playing. Get out of my parents' house." Lincoln didn't move. He rested his elbows on the table, linking his hands together. There was a dark, bruised look under his eyes. "I didn't come here for a reunion, Chanel. I came on business." Chanel laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Business? My father is a retired mechanic, dying of emphysema. What business could the head of the Brown family possibly have here?" Lincoln reached inside his breast pocket. The movement was slow, telegraphed, ensuring she didn't panic. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper and slid it across the table. It stopped near the edge, right where the street lamp illuminated it. "Your father owes Destry Costa 80 grand, Lincoln said quietly. Chanel stared at the paper. The name hit her like a physical blow. Costa. Even she knew that name. He was a bottom feeder, a loan shark, who preyed on the desperate, taking their homes and flipping the land to developers. "So?" Chanel challenged, her chin lifting defiantly, though her legs felt like water. "What does that have to do with you? You don't work with Costa. Your family hates him." Lincoln stood up. The chair scraped against the linoleum. He was taller than she remembered, his physical presence dominating the cramped space. He walked toward her, and Chanel had to force her feet to stay planted. She would not run from him. Not again. He stopped a foot away from her. The smell of him was overwhelming now. Leather, cold air, and something dangerously metallic. He looked down at her, a muscle feathering in his jaw. "I don't work with Costa," Lincoln agreed, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "I bought the debt from him." The words hung in the suffocating silence of the kitchen, heavy and toxic. Chanel stared at his chest, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing beneath the wool coat. Her brain struggled to process the information, misfiring against the sheer audacity of his presence. "You bought it," she repeated, the words tasting like copper. She finally dragged her eyes up to meet his. "Why?" Lincoln held her gaze. There was no warmth there, only a cold, guarded calculation. "Because Costa was going to send his guys to break your father's legs by the weekend. And when Arthur couldn't pay, Costa was going to take the house and throw your parents out on the street." Chanel's chest tightened painfully. "And you care so much about my parents? The same parents who banned you from this house when we were 17? A dark amusement flashed in his eyes, gone in an instant. "I don't give a damn about Arthur's pride or his house, Chanel. But I knew the second Costa made his move, your mother would call you, and you would come running back. So you bought the debt too. What? Control me?" Chanel stepped into his space, anger finally eclipsing the shock. She jabbed a finger hard into his chest. Beneath the coat, he felt like solid rock. "You think you own us now? Is that it? You think because I'm standing here you've bought me, Lincoln?" He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at where her finger pressed against him. He just looked at her face, studying the furious tear, tracking down her cheek. "I bought the debt," he said, his voice deadly calm, "because you don't survive a week with Destry Costa. You left this town to stay clean, Chanel. I bought it to keep Costa's filth away from you." Chanel let out a shaky breath, her hand dropping to her side. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. Men like Lincoln Brown didn't operate out of the goodness of their hearts. Every favor was a transaction. Every rescue was a cage. You don't do favors, Lincoln. You do transactions. So, what's the price? Lincoln looked away from her, staring out the window into the dark driveway. The harsh lines of his profile were illuminated by the street lamp. He looked exhausted, carrying a weight that Chanel couldn't even begin to fathom. 100,000, Lincoln said quietly. Chanel blinked. What? Costa wouldn't sell it for what it was worth. He knew I wanted it. I paid 100 grand for the paper. Lincoln turned back to her. Your father owes me, which means you owe me. I don't have $100,000, Chanel hissed, her voice trembling with absolute helpless rage. I'm a mid-level marketing manager in Chicago. I have a lease, a car payment, and $15 in my savings account. If you came here to shake me down, you're wasting your time. I know exactly how much you have in your account, Lincoln said dryly. The invasion of privacy made Chanel's skin crawl. Then, what do you want? Lincoln took a slow step closer, closing the final gap between them. He was so close, Chanel could feel the body heat radiating from him. She felt pinned against the kitchen counter, trapped between the edge of the sink and the terrifying reality of the man in front of her. He raised a hand, and Chanel tensed, fully expecting him to grab her. Instead, his fingers rough, calloused, scarred, brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was agonizingly gentle. It broke Chanel. It shattered the tough, cynical armor she had spent 7 years building. A choked sob escaped her throat, and she hated herself for it. I want you to stay, Lincoln whispered, his thumb lightly grazing her jawline. Chanel squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the trembling in her legs. I can't stay here, Lincoln. You know I can't. This town, this life, it kills everything it touches. I own the debt, he repeated softly, his hand dropping away from her face. The sudden absence of his touch felt colder than the winter air outside. You want to pay it off? You work for me. You use that sharp city brain of yours to audit my legal fronts. You sit at a desk in my office. You clean up my books, and you stay in this town until the debt is clear. Chanel opened her eyes, staring at him in horror. You want me to launder your money? I want you to organize my legitimate businesses, Lincoln corrected smoothly, stepping back, instantly reverting to the cold, untouchable boss. I pay you a salary. You put a portion toward the debt. It keeps your parents in their house. It keeps Costa off your back. And it puts a target on mine, Chanel countered bitterly. If I work for you, the FBI, your rivals, everyone will look at me. No one touches what belongs to me, Lincoln said. The words weren't a reassurance. They were a territorial claim, spoken with a quiet violence that chilled her to the bone. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a stark black business card, and set it on the counter next to the sink. You have until tomorrow night, Chanel. If you don't show up at the office, I sell the debt back to Costa, and whatever happens to your father after that is on you. He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned and walked toward the back door. Chanel watched him go, her heart hammering a frantic, trapped rhythm in her chest. Lincoln, she called out, right as his hand hit the doorknob. He paused, glancing over his shoulder. You're punishing me, Chanel said, her voice raw, for leaving you at that station. Lincoln's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, pooling with a decade of unspoken grief and rage. You left me to drown, Chanel, he said softly. Now, I'm just teaching you how to swim. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, leaving Chanel completely alone in the dark, staring at the black card on the counter. The smell of smoke and peppermint lingered in the air, a ghost that refused to be exorcised. To be continued. Would you like me to continue with parts 4 and 5, exploring Chanel's descent into Lincoln's world and the final confrontation with Destry Costa? Fluorescent bulbs flickered in the drop ceiling, emitting a high-pitched hum that drilled directly into the base of Chanel's skull. She sat at a heavy oak desk, staring at the dual monitors until the columns of numbers blurred into meaningless gray smears. It had been 3 weeks. 3 weeks of pretending she was simply an auditor for Brown Logistics. 3 weeks of inhaling the sharp, chemical scent of ozone from the industrial copy machine and the stale, yeasty smell of old donuts in the break room. The office was located in an industrial park on the edge of town, a sprawling warehouse of corrugated steel and frosted glass. It was thoroughly, painfully mundane. There were no mobsters in pinstripe suits polishing Tommy guns. There were just tired men in high-vis vests driving forklifts and women with carpal tunnel aggressively typing up shipping manifests. That was the genius of Lincoln's operation. It was so ordinary, it was invisible. Chanel rubbed her burning eyes, the rough fabric of her gray slacks biting into her thighs. She clicked her mouse, opening another encrypted file. She had found the rot on day 4. Lincoln wasn't just using the logistics company to wash cash from underground gambling rings. He was bleeding his own legitimate fronts dry to buy up commercial real estate along the South Riverfront. Warehouses, empty lots, condemned tenements. He was overpaying for useless dirt, hemorrhaging capital at a rate that made Chanel's chest tight with secondhand panic. A heavy, measured footstep sounded on the industrial carpeting behind her. Chanel didn't turn around. She knew the cadence of that walk. She knew the sudden, subtle shift in the room's air pressure, the faint scent of wintergreen and dark roast coffee that always preceded him. "You're here late," Lincoln said. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating against the quiet hum of the empty office. "The books were a disaster," Chanel replied, keeping her eyes fixed on the screen. "Your previous accountant was either an idiot or actively stealing from you. I'm leaning toward the latter." Lincoln stopped just behind her chair. He didn't lean in, but his proximity was a physical weight. Chanel's pulse kicked up a notch, a frustrating, involuntary betrayal. "He was stealing," Lincoln confirmed, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. "He no longer works for me." Chanel swallowed hard, forcing herself not to ask what "no longer works for me" meant in the Brown family. She finally turned her chair around to face him. Lincoln looked worse than he had in her mother's kitchen. The shadows beneath his eyes were bruised and purple, and the sharp lines of his jaw seemed carved from exhaustion. He had loosened his dark silk tie, and the top button of his shirt was undone, revealing a sliver of olive skin and a faded, jagged burn scar near his collarbone. He looked like a man holding up a crumbling ceiling with his bare hands. "You're liquidating your clean assets to buy the South Riverfront," Chanel said, her cynical edge sharpening to cut through the heavy tension. She pointed a pen at the monitors. "It's a terrible investment, Lincoln. The city isn't developing down there for another decade. You're draining your cash reserves." "Why?" Lincoln's dark eyes flicked to the screen, then back down to her. "That isn't your concern. Just balance the incoming logistics revenue." "It becomes my concern when the math doesn't work," Chanel snapped, slamming the pen onto the desk. The sharp crack made Lincoln flinch, just barely. "You're exposed. If you have a bad month at the docks, you can't make payroll. And if you can't make payroll, people start talking." She stood up, see Brown her arms defensively. "And more importantly, Destry Costa owns the only working freight terminal on that riverfront. You're boxing him in." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The air conditioning kicked off with a heavy clank, leaving only the sound of their breathing. "Costa is a disease," Lincoln said quietly, taking a step closer. The exhaustion in his face gave way to a frightening, cold intensity. "He loans money to people like your father, takes their homes, and uses the land to build cheap, unregulated storage for his trafficking routes. I'm buying the riverfront to choke him out." Chanel stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're going to war with him. I am securing my territory," Lincoln corrected, his gaze dropping to her mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her eyes. "You bought my father's debt to piss Costa off," Chanel realized, the truth hitting her like a bucket of ice water. The narrative shifted, twisting violently in her head. "It wasn't just about me. It was a strategic move. You took 80 grand of Costa's leverage right out from under him, and now you're boxing him in on the river. You didn't save my parents, Lincoln. You made them collateral." Lincoln's jaw locked, the muscle there feathered, a tight, dangerous twitch. "I kept your father's legs from being broken in his own living room. Costa wouldn't have stopped at the house, Chanel. He would have taken the cars, the pensions, and left them in the gutter. Yes, I used it as leverage against him. But I also kept you safe. I don't want your version of safe, Tikete, Chanel yelled, the sound echoing harshly off the frosted glass of the cubicles. Her hands were shaking. She hated the raw, desperate sound of her own voice. I spent 7 years building a life where I didn't have to look over my shoulder, where I didn't have to wonder if the man I cut herself off, her teeth clicking shut. Lincoln's eyes darkened, completely eclipsing the exhaustion. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Chanel backed up, her hips hitting the edge of the oak desk. She was trapped. He planted his hands on the desk on either side of her, caging her in. The smell of him was overwhelming leather, cold air, and something deeply male and terrifyingly familiar. Say it, Lincoln breathed, his face inches from hers. The man, you. What, Chanel? She looked away, staring at the knot of his silk tie. Her throat felt tight, thick with unshed tears and a decade of buried grief. The man I loved was going to end up in a body bag, she whispered, the words scraping out of her. I couldn't watch it happen, Lincoln. I couldn't. Lincoln let out a ragged breath. He dropped his forehead to rest against her shoulder. The gesture was so unexpectedly fragile, so entirely human, that Chanel's breath hitched. She could feel the heat of his skin through her thin blouse, the heavy, erratic thud of his heart against her chest. I'm still here, he murmured into her neck, his voice barely audible. I'm still breathing, Chanel. Slowly, hesitantly, Chanel raised her trembling hands. She didn't push him away. Instead, her fingers curled into the heavy wool of his suit jacket. It was a surrender, a quiet, terrifying acceptance of the gravity she had never truly escaped. Downstairs, the heavy metal door of the warehouse bay violently slammed open. The sound cracked through the building like a gunshot. Lincoln's head snapped up, the fragile moment shattering into a million jagged pieces. He pushed off the desk, instantly placing his body between Chanel and the office doorway. His hand slipped beneath his suit jacket, drawing a matte black heavy-caliber pistol with a terrifying, practiced fluidity. Get under the desk, Lincoln ordered. His voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was dead, flat, and absolute. Footsteps echoed up the metal stairwell. Not one person. 3. Heavy boots, striking the grating, with a deliberate, unhurried rhythm. Chanel dropped to her knees, scrambling into the dark cavity beneath the oak desk. The carpet smelled of dust and old shoe polish. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to press them flat against the floorboards to keep from crying out. Lincoln Brown, a voice called out. It was a wet, gravelly sound, carrying a sickeningly cheerful lilt. Working late on a Friday. Your dedication to the community is truly inspiring. Chanel held her breath. She didn't need to see the man to know who it was. The smell hit the office a second later, cheap, overly sweet pomade and the stale, lingering reek of cheap cigars. Destry Costa, you're trespassing, Destry, Lincoln said quietly. Chanel could see the toes of Lincoln's leather Oxfords, planted firmly just inches from the edge of the desk. He hadn't moved an inch. Trespassing, Costa laughed. The sound was a harsh, wet bark. I'm just visiting an old business partner. You bought a piece of paper from me a few weeks ago, Lincoln. Arthur Perez, the dying mechanic. The debt is cleared. The transaction is closed. For you, maybe? Costa sneered. Chanel heard the rustle of clothing, the heavy click of a gun safety disengaging. But see, I started doing some digging. Why would the great Lincoln Brown pay $100,000 for a broken old man's mortgage? And then I saw her. The daughter, driving a leased sedan, walking into your nice, clean logistics company. Chanel clamped a hand over her mouth. Her lungs burned. She's a civilian, Destry, Lincoln said, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a lethal chill. You touch her, and I will burn your riverfront terminal to the ground with you inside it. You don't have the muscle for a war, Lincoln, Costa spat, the fake cheer evaporating. You've spent all your cash buying my garbage lots. You're bleeding out, and I want the girl. She's the collateral you stole from me. Hand her over, and maybe I don't drop you right here. No, It was a single word, final, unshakable. The silence that followed was heavy, stretched so tight, it felt like a physical wire about to snap. Then, the world exploded. The noise was deafening in the confined office space. It wasn't like the movies. It was a concussive, physically painful roar that rattled Chanel's teeth in her skull. Bang, bang, crack. Gunpowder and cordite instantly flooded the air, sharp and sulfurous, burning the back of Chanel's throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her forehead against the rough carpet. Wood splintered above her. Glass shattered, raining down in thousands of tiny, musical tinkles. A heavy thud shook the floorboards. Someone screamed a high, wet sound that cut off abruptly with a sickening crunch. More gunfire. 2 precise, rhythmic shots. Bam, bam. Then, a deafening, ringing silence. Chanel sobbed into her hand, unable to stop the sound. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp, coppery stench of fresh blood. Chanel. It was Lincoln. His voice was strained, wet, and ragged. She crawled out from beneath the desk. The office was a war zone. The dual monitors were blown out, sparking faintly. The frosted glass wall of the cubicle was completely gone. Near the doorway, 2 men in dark leather jackets lay motionless on the carpet in spreading pools of dark, thick red. Destry Costa was slumped against the copy machine, his chest a ruined, wet mess. His dead eyes stared blankly at the fluorescent ceiling lights. Lincoln was leaning heavily against the filing cabinet. His gun was still in his hand, hanging limply at his side. He was breathing in shallow, jagged gasps. His left hand was pressed tightly against his right side, just below his ribs. Dark, thick blood seeped through his fingers, staining his crisp white shirt a heavy, terrifying crimson. "Lincoln," Chanel gasped, scrambling to her feet. Her cynicism, her fear, her carefully constructed walls, all of it, completely evaporated, burned away by the harsh, violent reality of the blood dripping onto the carpet. She rushed to him, grabbing his arm as his knees buckled. He was impossibly heavy, his dead weight dragging her down. They collapsed together onto the floor. "I'm fine," Lincoln gritted out, his head falling back against the metal cabinet. His skin was already turning a waxy, pale gray. "It's a through and through," missed the lung. "Shut up," Chanel sobbed, pressing her hands directly over his, pushing down hard on the wound. The blood was hot, sticky, and sickeningly slick. The smell of it was primal, cutting through the cordite and ozone. "You're not fine. You're bleeding out." Lincoln looked at her, despite the pain carving lines into his face. His dark eyes were completely clear. He reached up with his clean left hand, his trembling fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek, smearing a streak of his own blood across her skin. "He won't bother your father anymore," Lincoln whispered, his eyelids fluttering. Chanel stared at him, the harsh, ugly truth settling heavily into her bones. He had known Costa was coming. He had boxed him in, forced his hand, and taken the bullet so she wouldn't have to look over her shoulder ever again. This was the transaction. This was the toll. She couldn't leave him, not this time. The sterile, quiet life in Chicago felt like a hollow illusion compared to the raw, bleeding man in her arms. She belonged in this messy, violent gravity. "Stay with me," Chanel demanded, her voice losing its tremble, hardening into a fierce, unbreakable resolve. She pressed down harder on the wound, ignoring his sharp hiss of pain. "You don't get to buy my life and then check out, Lincoln Brown. Do you hear me? You stay with me." Lincoln managed a faint, bloody smile, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm not going anywhere, Chanel." Did Chanel make the right choice by stepping into the darkness to save her family? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this gritty, grounded Mafia romance, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow story lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, raw storytelling. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support helps us bring more immersive audio dramas to life.